will attack officials who at meetings in the village declare that the amount of procurements has increased yet again. They will attack them with cleavers, with stones. But most of the time, farmers will simply use the weight of the numbers and attack, for instance, freight trains. In January 1961, in Gansu province, in one single month, the Public Security Bureau investigated some 500 cases of attacks on trains. In one case, 4,000 farmers gather by a railway, wait for that freight train to approach, stop it, and strip it of every movable bit of property. In one case, they find military uniforms. So, of course, it is bitterly cold in Gansu in the winter. They put on these uniforms. A week later, they approach a state granary. The doors open magically. The guards, of course, mistaken for special forces. And in some cases, there are actually real open rebellions, including weapons. This happened in Xuanwei in 1960, when several villages, with the collusion of the local cadres, arm themselves and start fighting for what they see as the freedom to till your own land and the freedom to actually trade what you have produced as a cultivator. Zhou Enlai has to send in the army to suppress that rebellion. It's not the only one. There are literally dozens of armed rebellions in any one region, in any one year during this Great Leap Forward. Now, how do we finish? I've reached the end of my talk. I've looked at the violence that is very much directed against cultivators, farmers, villagers during the Great Leap Forward. I've also looked at the scope of destruction caused by the command economy, radical collectivization. I've also tried to tease out the strategies, or some of the strategies of survival of ordinary people. But there are really no heroes in this story. What comes to mind is the work by Primo Levi, who was a survivor of Auschwitz. And one of the first things, he was a very honest man, and a great writer, one of the very first things he said when he came out of Auschwitz, when he managed to survive, is to say that he was no hero. That heroes were dead. In order for him to survive, he had to make all sorts of moral compromises. For instance, by not sharing some food that he might have found. And during this period, from 1958 to 1962, just about everybody, in particular poor, ordinary people, were forced by a system very much put in place by one man called Mao Zedong to make all sorts of compromises and undergo routine degradations along with the mass destruction of their ways of life and their villages. Now, Primo Levi referred to that whole period as a grey zone. He didn't see any real villains, didn't see any real heroes there either. He noticed that the whole system reduces everybody forces everybody to make very difficult choices. He called it the grey zone, one grey zone, as opposed to black and white. Well, I would say 58 to 62, the whole Great Leap Forward is one massive grey zone in modern China's history. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ducater, for a very eye-opening and heart-rending presentation about an inadequately understood period in Chinese history. Now, I turn to the floor for a question and answer session. Please raise your hand if you have a question. First over here.
Could you please talk about the role of the Western intelligence agencies in China at this time?
You mean the CIA or the British Embassy? Well, I've read some of those reports, those CIA reports, and some of the some of those weekly, monthly bulletins that the British Embassy would send to London. And I think it's fair to say that in the case of the UK, they didn't really have a clue of what was going on. In fact, some of them were quite out of their way to say that allegations about the famine taking place in China between 58 and 62 at the time were vastly overstated. There's no evidence of any famine at all. As to the CIA, they didn't really discuss it, but they must have known at some point. But there's one country that knew very well what was going on. That was not the Soviet Union. You may be thinking of the Soviet Union. I don't think the Soviet Union didn't really care what was happening all that much. After all the grain that was being procured, a lot of it was being shipped to the Soviet Union to pay for all these massive factories, all that massive amounts of equipment that China was importing in 1957 and 58, anticipating a great leap forward into communism. So the Soviet Union didn't know much either. But Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, the Jiaochaqiu, or the equivalent of the FBI in Taiwan, they knew very well what was going on. They had remarkable intelligence reports, which I read but didn't use for obvious reasons. They knew very well, and they must have handed over that information to the United States. But of course, the United States was very wary of Chiang Kai-shek. Here, after all, a man who might decide to invade the People's Republic of China and drag the United States into a war with the Soviet Union. So just about everybody here, the Soviet Union and the United States and the UK, were trying to downplay what happened in that country at that time. You pick the questions. Sure.
I wondered at the end of this disaster how it was explained by the officials, and did it actually mean the end of collectivization, or just, I don't know, maybe a gradual move towards individual farming, or at least something that isn't as radical as what it did?
One way of explaining it was to blame it on nature. And you see this pretty much in every man-made disaster, in particular under communist states, whether we're talking about the famine in Ukraine under Stalin, whether we're talking about Mao or Pol Pot, or of course North Korea, where there was a famine in the 1990s, or possibly even more recently. There might have still been many people dying under that. The explanation is always the natural environment. And then another explanation at the time, immediately in 62, among the top leadership, was to actually take the blame by saying that everybody at the top level had made mistakes in listening to the policies that Chairman Mao had devised. In other words, Chairman Mao was quite accurate, and his vision of the Great Leap Forward was perfectly fine. It's the way in which the party actually executed his vision that things went wrong. And then a third technique that communist regimes use all the time, of course, is to blame the local powers on the ground and call them counter-revolutionaries. So here are people on the ground who are being purged in 1957 and 58, removed from the party and replaced by very unscrupulous hard men willing to benefit from these radical winds that blow from Beijing, Mao's willing executioners that are being praised for what they accomplish, increasing the crop, increasing the quotas, increasing steel production. And then a year later, or 2 years later, they become the targets of yet another purge. They become the counter-revolutionaries. So, blame it on nature, or blame it on the local officials. These are two very common techniques. And within the partyship itself, volunteer to take blame in order to save face for number one.
Hello. Hi there. In reading portions of your book and absorbing some of the staggering death toll statistics, and also the concept of food being used as a weapon, which I actually haven't encountered in other writings thus far, I hear a lot of things like disaster, catastrophe, crime against humanity, but I rarely hear the term murder come into play in this conversation. Do you think that it is far-fetched to call Chairman Mao, because of his policies, a mass murderer? And I don't believe that that is a term associated with him even today, even though it may be what in fact he is.
I think that's a really, really interesting question. To start with, when somebody starves, that's one thing. But when you actually starve somebody to death, well, that's murder in my book. And when I spoke to The Independent, a British newspaper, after the Woodstock Festival, where I gave a talk about a month ago, I went on record by saying that Mao must count of one, not the only one of the great mass murderers in human history. Now, this is very controversial, and that's quite normal, because a lawyer will say that there has to be intent. Did Mao actually intend to kill these people? Certainly Hitler intended to kill very specific groups of people. Surely Stalin too had targets in mind, but not Mao. Well, I would say that Mao is the one who devised a system by which everybody, every unit, every county, every province was ranked according to the ability to fulfill a particular set of targets. You had a white flag, you were seen to be a bad element, a backward rightist, where you got a red flag. These were symbolic designations. But these designations pretty much decided where you would live or not. As I said earlier on, when a local cadre has to decide who to feed and who not to feed, it is very frequently those who are seen to be so-called white flags, anti-bourgeois elements, counter-revolutionaries, rightist elements, bad elements, you name it, there's a whole vocabulary there. Those are the ones who are actually being starved to death. And then there's something else. You've got to take into account how history develops very, 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 very gradually. It takes a long time before historians actually start looking at what Stalin did. And it's not just archives opening up, it's thinking about responsibility and how where responsibility must go. It's thinking about the scale of the horror and who actually initiated this whole thing. When it comes to Adolf Hitler, there were debates. To this day, in fact, the discovery of the minutes of the Wannsee conference. Wannsee is a small suburb just outside of Berlin, where the Nazi leadership made a final solution, came up with a final solution. Well, the minutes of that meeting really tie Hitler to the Holocaust. But even after the discovery of those minutes, to this day, there are still historians, and very respectable ones, like Ernst Nolte, who will say that those minutes are probably fake. So it doesn't quite show that Hitler was entirely informed about what was happening. So with Mao, it's the same problem. There are still debates to this day about whether Stalin actually knew what was going on with the famine in the Ukraine. Now, one day you read a book, there's no doubt about Stalin being responsible. And 2 years later, there's another book by another historian having used archives in Russia who shows that, well, Stalin may not have been responsible. So these debates take a very long time. But the key point really must also be that Stalin, Hitler, Mao, within these massive one-party states, are masters at deflecting criticism. They're also masters at being rather obscure. There is the term working towards the Führer. We don't quite know what the Führer is saying, but we should interpret what he says. Well, you could use the same sort of analogy for Stalin and for Mao. Mao is very cryptic when he says the problem of the Yellow River must be solved. What does that mean? Does it mean you build a massive dam? You don't build a dam? You start irrigation work? Very cryptic in his pronouncements. But I can tell you one thing. On the 25th of March, 1959, 25th of March, 1959, at the Jinjiang Hotel, at a conference that is never mentioned, Mao makes it very clear in minutes of top leadership, minutes of a top leadership gathering, Mao makes it very clear that the party should go out and take up to 1/3 of all the grain, a rate of procurement that China has never seen before. He says you must go out and take up to 1/3 of all the grain. He says let half the people die, provided the other half can actually be filled. He makes available trucks to make sure that the grain can be taken. Why? Because he, like Zhou Enlai, like Deng Xiaoping, they are all very much in agreement on at least one point, namely that it is more important for China to pay the Soviet Union and fulfill its obligations than it is to actually feed the people in the countryside. Zhou Enlai is the first one who said this already by the end of 1958. He says, I would rather not eat rather than not pay my debt to the Soviet Union. Now, of course, he doesn't mean that he's not going to eat. He means the people out there should eat less. So,
while all this was going on, where were the educators? What happened to the intellectual or intelligent people? What was going on with them? Had they no opinions? Did they have no influence?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. I tell you where about 500,000 of them were at that point in time. About 500,000 were in labor camps.
Oh.
You see, in 1956, 57, Mao actually thought that it might be a good idea to have intellectuals speak out and let them contribute to this great revolution. Let them speak out and say what is wrong with the Communist Party in order to avoid what had happened in Hungary and Budapest, which was a popular uprising against the communist state. Mao thought, well, let's cultivate the intellectuals. Let 100 flowers bloom. Let's have 100 flowers. Let everybody speak up. Of course, nobody spoke out because they had already spoken out on previous occasions, and they had noticed that something quite bad happens to you when you do that. So few people spoke out. And Mao insisted, speak out, don't be afraid. So then bit by bit, intellectuals, students started speaking out, started writing very critically, and then came the backlash, the so-called anti-rightist campaign in 1957. Where literally hundreds of thousands of intellectuals and students are shipped off to labor camps. And of course, ordinary people, because I'm not so sure that a Peking professor actually knows, how to grow rice. I don't know. I'm not from Peking, I don't know how to grow rice. Local farmers have been doing this for generations. You might